Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Spanish price revolution. In this journey you'll see how a mountain of silver in the Andes touched off a century of rising prices across Europe, how a simple change in mining technology unlocked lower grade ore and multiplied output, and how a single port city managed the flow of treasure that rewired markets. By the end, you'll understand why a headline like "More Silver" can mean very different things for wages, food, and power. Let's set the stage. The year is 1545, high in the Andes, at a place that will soon be called Cerro Rico, literally, the rich mountain, above the town of Potosi. Imagine a cone of rock so mineral-laden that it becomes a magnet for fortune-seekers, officials, mules, and mint workers. Now, at first, silver mining is limited by the easiest ore. But in the mid-1550s, something changes. A technique called the patio process spreads. It uses mercury to bind with finely crushed silver ore, forming an amalgam that can be heated to separate out the silver. Why is that a big deal? Because it turns previously marginal rocks, the lower-grade ores, into pay dirt. Output scales. The bottleneck shifts from "is there ore" to "can we mill it and supply mercury?" Now, follow that silver's route in your mind. From Potosi, caravans move metal by llama and mule toward Pacific and Atlantic outlets. Bars and coins converge on New Spain and Peru's administrative hubs, then cross to Caribbean staging points, and finally funnel into a single metropolitan artery, Seville. That's where the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, registers fleets, tallies cargo, and applies the rules of empire to a river of bullion. The Spanish monarchy doesn't just stumble upon treasure, it builds a system to move it. Convoys, or treasure fleets, sail under guard. Manifests are recorded. Customs are collected. Risks are pooled because storms and pirates are real. What does that mean for prices? Think of Europe in the late 1500s as a patchwork of markets with frictions. Money is not just a number in a ledger, it's metal you can weigh. When more silver enters circulation, people can bid more readily for grain, cloth, rents, and wages. But it doesn't happen everywhere at once or to the same degree. Still, when you zoom out over decades, historians observe a clear pattern, a sustained rise in the general level of prices often called the price revolution. This is not a weekend spike, it is a century-long upward drift, visible even when you average across goods and years. One careful way we see this is through compiled price series, for example, tracking the cost of staple goods in Spain year after year. The shape of the curve matters. Prices accelerate through the mid-1500s, crest close to the turn of 1600, and only ease later, after about 1650. That timing aligns with the silver story, the discovery window, the technological unlock of the patio process, and the consolidation of imperial logistics. The curve is a fingerprint of mechanisms in motion. Pause and consider the everyday experience underneath that curve. If you're paid in money that buys less bread each season, you feel the pressure first at the market stall. If you're a landlord, you might try to reset rents upward. If you're a town council buying timber or iron for repairs, your budget stretches less far. None of these people need to know about the Casa de Contratación. They just react to new constraints. But the path of the metal, who handles it, taxes it, spends it, quietly shapes whose prices move earliest and how quickly pressures spread. Notice, too, that Seville is more than a port, it is a nerve center that transmits shocks. When fleets arrive heavy with bullion, merchants settle accounts, creditors get paid, and crown expenditures reach soldiers and suppliers. In good years the pulse is strong. In lean years, storms or embargoes slow the heartbeat. Through it all, the repeated arrival of treasure creates expectations. People start to plan around seasons of silver. And expectations can be as powerful as coins themselves in pushing prices. Now, we should avoid the easy trap of saying silver equals inflation, full stop. Reality is more textured. The effect is mediated by technology, by trade routes, by policy, and by markets outside Spain. But at this introductory scale, one truth is already visible: a massive, sustained increase in the monetary metal did not merely enrich the state. It repriced everyday life across the continent, inch by inch, decade by decade. So as we close this first slide, hold on to three anchors. First, the geographic fact: a mountain called Potosi, enabled by mercury amalgamation, produced silver on a scale Europe had never seen. Second, the institutional fact: Seville's Casa de Contratación and the treasure fleets concentrated and routed that flow through an imperial bottleneck. Third, the macro pattern: over the 1500s, price indices in Spain rise sharply and only ease after the mid-1600s. These anchors will help you interpret every chart and story that follows. When we talk about prices changing, we are really talking about systems, mines, mints, fleets, and offices converting ore into purchasing power, and purchasing power into a new normal. Ready to watch how those systems shape incentives and outcomes, sometimes in ways no one intended? Let's move to the next slide. Ask a simple question with big consequences: who gets the new money first? In our story, it is not the economy. It is specific hands in a specific order. Miners and mill owners near Potosi, royal officials and paymasters in Seville, merchants who clear accounts when fleets dock, and only then, gradually, everyone else. Start at the mine mouth. When freshly minted coins appear, managers pay wages, buy timber and tools, rent animals, and contract freight. Local sellers feel a sudden, reliable buyer with cash in hand. What happens next? The price of the things those buyers want most moves first. Food, fuel, pack animals, lodging, freight services. Not every price moves at once. That selective early push is the key. Now jump to Seville. When the treasure fleets arrive, officials assess, merchants settle old balances, and the crown spends on supplies and payroll. That spending concentrates demand in and around the port and along the routes that serve it. Bakers and butchers near those pay points see customers with newly heavy purses. Meanwhile, a weaver far from the flow might see little change today. Tomorrow, perhaps. But not yet. This staggered path is what later economists call the Cantillon effect. New money does not drop evenly from the sky. It enters through channels. First recipients spend it in patterns that reflect their needs and contracts. Prices of those items move first. Relatives' prices shift, and those shifts guide resources long before any national average creeps higher. Here is a concrete picture. A soldier paid near the dock spends on bread, wine, lodging, and transport. Those prices rise around the garrison and along supply roads. A merchant who just cleared a big account can now bid for imported cloth or spices, nudging those prices next. A rural day laborer paid months later faces higher food costs before his own wage has fully adjusted. The headline number called inflation is the average of many small waves. But the lived experience is the sequence of those waves hitting different shores at different times. There is also geography in the timing. Silver concentrates in Spain first, then radiates through commercial hubs like Antwerp and Amsterdam as bills are settled and goods are purchased. That means you can actually observe lags. Prices in Spain tend to move before prices farther north. The mechanism is not mysterious. Coins travel with contracts. Contracts pull goods. Goods compete for limited capacity. Relative prices adjust along the way. Notice the difference between a general rise in the price level and a pattern of relative price changes. If food and local services jump first near the entry points, households reallocate spending. Millers order more grain. Carters shift wagons toward better-paying routes. Investors tilt toward trades closest to the new demand. By the time the average price index registers a clear trend, the allocation of people and capital has already started to change. Why does this matter for interpretation? Because if you only watch the average, you miss the mechanism. A smooth line on a chart can hide sharp, uneven transitions underneath. If you want to understand winners and losers, you follow the path of the coins. Who is paid first? What do they buy? Where do they spend? In what order do wages and contracts reset? Those are not side notes. They are the story. One last point for this slide. Expectations learn the rhythm of these arrivals. If merchants in Seville expect seasonal inflows, they stock up ahead of the fleets. If suppliers to the crown expect big orders after docking, they raise quotes in advance. Anticipation pulls some of tomorrow's price changes into today. Again, not everywhere at once, but exactly where the channels run deepest. So, how money enters matters. It sets the sequence, shapes relative prices, and quietly steers resources before anyone announces a grand inflation number. Keep that lens in mind as we move forward, because once you see the channels, the next pieces of the puzzle start falling into place. Think of this as the empire's hidden waterworks. Silver is the reservoir, but wars, garrisons, and shipyards are miles downstream. To move purchasing power from the dock to the battlefield, the crown builds pipes, short-term asientos and long-term duros. If you understand how those pipes work, you can predict where pressure will build, where valves will fail, and whose wells run dry first. Start with the asientos. These are short-term, high-trust credit lines extended to the monarchy by powerful merchant banking houses, many of them genos. Why would bankers front cash to a crown that's always at war? Because they are paid with fees, privileges, and often with a claim on future tax receipts or incoming bullion. They don't wait for the next fleet to unload, they advance funds now, then get repaid when the silver arrives or when taxes come in. The logic is simple: transform a lumpy, seasonal inflow into steady cash outgo for soldiers, munitions, and grain. But the risk is obvious. If fleets are late, if a campaign overruns its budget, or if tax receipts fall short, the entire schedule slips. Now the Juros. Think of these as long-term annuities, debt instruments backed by specific taxes. The monarchy says to investors, give us capital today, and we will earmark a slice of, say, the sales tax or a customs duty to pay you a fixed stream over time. That does two things at once. It pushes the cost of today's wars into tomorrow's revenue, and it hardwires taxes toward debt service before anything else. Once those streams are pledged, local treasurers have less discretion. Every coin of the alcabala, every levy of the servicio de mil ones, increasingly has a destination before the town even collects it. What happens when the pipes clog? You see it in the payment suspensions. Under Philip II, the crises of 1557 through 60, then again 1575 through 77, and 1596 through 97. Under Philip III, a moratorium in 1607. A bankruptcy in this world does not mean the empire vanishes, it means the crown halts payments, forces negotiations, stretches maturities, converts short-term IOUs into longer-term Juros, and tries to restart the pumps. Credit doesn't evaporate, but it becomes more expensive, more conditional, and more political. Follow the ripple effects at ground level. When a suspension hits, court bankers and tax farmers get priority in the reshuffle because they sit closest to the valves. Town councils waiting on reimbursements for supplies suddenly face a cash drought. Fairs where bills are settled thin out. Merchants tighten terms. A carpenter who once sold on credit now asks for coin up front. That is working capital being crowded out by the fiscal plumbing itself. Not because silver has disappeared, but because the channels that move it are jammed with arrears and earmarks. Notice the subtlety. Even when the state resumes payments, the habit of pledging tax streams to Juros means that in normal times the first claimant on a town's commerce is not the town's own priorities, but the annuity holder. If you run a shop, you feel this as a higher indirect tax burden baked into every transaction. If you run a small manufactory, you feel it as tighter credit at the fairs and a greater sensitivity to any delay in government orders. The system keeps the army marching, but it demands a toll from the arteries of everyday trade. There's also a geographic rhythm. The Asientos network binds Seville, Genoa, and northern money markets into a circuit. When things go well, cash flows like pressure equalizing across connected pipes. When things go poorly, a blockage in Madrid can cause a pressure drop in a provincial town days away. You don't need to see the ledgers to observe the effects. You'll hear it in late wages, discounted warrants, and suddenly silent workshops. So what is the mechanism to carry forward? Short-term asientos turn future revenue into present spending. Long-term Juros pledge tax streams to creditors and make that pledge legally and politically sticky. Repeated suspension signal that the pipes were run at redline. And the cumulative effect is to tilt the playing field toward those plugged into court finance while making local commerce bear more of the adjustment when the flow slows. Keep that picture in mind as we move on. If the state's pipes can push more claims into circulation than silver and taxes can comfortably support, the next question practically asks itself, how do you make small payments when good silver is scarce and obligations keep arriving? That takes us to the monetary turn that comes next. Let's pause on a subtle turn in the story. For most of the 16th century, Spain's silver and gold coins held fairly steady standards. Then, near the century's end and into the early 1700s doorstep, policy pivots toward copper, vellon, first as a convenience for small change, and then as a revenue tool. That second part is where the trouble begins. Why issue copper at all? Because everyday life needs small coins. Paying a porter, buying a loaf, settling a tavern bill, those transactions don't need a fat silver reel. Copper fills the gap. But copper coins are mostly promise and only a little metal. Their value comes from law and confidence, not from what the coin is worth melted down. If the state mints a lot of copper quickly, especially to cover pressing expenses, it collects a profit called seigniorage. More coins out, more nominal means of payment in the marketplace. Now picture two monies bumping elbows in the same town. Silver remains the preferred settlement medium for large trades and long-distance finance. Copper circulates for small purchases and wages. On paper, the crown might declare a fixed equivalence, so many coppers equal one silver unit. But the market starts whispering a different story. Merchants quietly add a premium for silver or offer a discount for paying in vellon. That gap has a name in practice, the agio, the wedge between official parity and what people actually accept. What does that wedge look like on the street? A baker posts one price if you pay in vellon and a different one if you pay in silver. A landlord insists on silver for rent or raises the money price if you insist on copper. A cloth dealer might set a price in silver terms and then translate it, unhappily, into a higher vellon figure. The sign on the stall doesn't have to say dual pricing for everyone to feel it. People start carrying two mental ledgers, prices in copper and prices in silver. Here's the mechanism under the hood. When copper supply grows faster than silver and confidence in copper's convertibility slips, copper prices rise first and fastest, especially for the goods most bought with small change. Street food, firewood, ale, day labor. Meanwhile, contracts large enough to demand silver move more slowly. It's the same Cantillon logic you saw earlier, but now inside the currency system itself. Entry points and users matter, even between denominations. As the wedge widens, silver quietly retreats into hoards and wholesale networks. No conspiracy required, just prudence. If a coin that holds value better keeps buying more in a month than a coin that leaks purchasing power, you keep the sturdy one and spend the leaky one. That is the everyday version of Gresham's law: bad money pushes out good money from daily use. Shops begin to feel good coin shortages not because silver has vanished, but because it is being husbanded for the transactions where it is most demanded. Policy responses often try to cry up copper, declare a new legal value or mint lighter coins at the same face value. That can stabilize things for a moment, but it also trains everyone to expect another change. Prices measured in vellon climb a step, prices measured in silver move less or later. Account books in places like Seville start to show a growing divergence between copper-denominated series and silver-denominated series. The result is confusion. Not the theatrical kind, but the slow administrative grind, recalculating rents, rewriting wages, and renegotiating small debts every time the scale moves. Notice the human texture. If you are paid mostly in copper, your daily basket becomes more expensive first. If you are able to demand silver, because you sell wholesale goods or have bargaining power, you ride out the change longer. Two neighbors can live side by side under the same crown and feel very different economies simply because the coins in their purses are not the same. So the headline for this slide is plain. After a long swell of silver-driven price increases, the turn to heavy copper issuance creates a second layer, a wedge between small change prices and silver money. Dual pricing emerges, silver withdraws from the street, and copper prices race ahead. The inflation people feel most viscerally now clusters where copper is king, at the stall, in the tavern, on payday. Keep that picture in mind. We've watched how the composition of money alters the map of prices. Next, we'll see how these monetary choices spill into workshops, fairs, and town budgets, shaping competitiveness and credit in ways no simple average can capture. Here's where numbers on a ledger become the sound of hammers and the price of bread. When war finance and debt service rise, the state leans harder on indirect taxes, the kinds baked into everyday transactions. Think of sales levies, market fees, and duties that touch the things towns must buy just to function. Those taxes don't simply take money from pockets, they raise the cost of non-tradables, bread, firewood, rent, local transport, stall fees, even the permits that keep workshops open. And when non-tradables go up, urban producers feel a vice tighten from both sides. Start with a weaver in a Castilian town. Her inputs split into two families. Tradable inputs like imported dye or fine wool are priced by larger markets and can sometimes be sourced around a problem. But non-tradables, shop rent, the bread she feeds her apprentices, the charcoal for the dye kettle, the cartage within town, those are pinned to the local tax climate. If indirect taxes ratchet upward to feed juros and keep asientos current, the prices of these immovable, local items rise first and stay high. Her unit costs climb before her selling price can adjust. Margins thin. Quality is trimmed at the edges. Delivery slips. Reputation suffers. Now widen the lens to the whole town. The baker pays more for fuel, the miller pays more for tolls, the carter pays more for the right to pass a gate. Each adds a small markup to survive. Those small markups cascade through the urban cost structure. Meanwhile, the fairs and credit markets that once greased trade are jittery from periodic payment suspensions and tax pledges. Sellers shorten terms. Buyers hesitate. Working capital is harder to come by unless you are close to court finance. A workshop that once floated a month of wages on credit now needs coin by Tuesday. One missed convoy, One sick apprentice, and the stitch that holds the budget together starts to pull. Competitiveness is not just about clever artisans, it's about the ground they stand on. Compare this environment with the Low Countries, where institutions and incentives increasingly reward enterprise during this era. Not because life is easy there, plenty of risks remain, but because basic rules make it easier to turn skill and savings into a growing shop. Contracts are enforced predictably. Merchant networks thicken. Insurance, bills of exchange, and partnerships flourish. When a weaver faces a choice, stay where non-tradables keep rising and credit shortens, or move to a place where rules and networks raise the payoff to effort, the migration of skills begins to make sense. Follow the talent. A skilled dyer hears that in a northern port city he can lease a workspace with clearer terms and access a denser market of suppliers and buyers. A ship carpenter learns that freight is steadier there, and that guild rules, while strict, line up with expanding trade rather than with shrinking margins. A factor managing rural wool shipments discovers that warehouse finance is cheaper and collection less political. None of these decisions require a manifesto. They are quiet calculations, household by household, made under the pressure of higher local costs and thinner urban margins. Notice the pattern that emerges without any grand proclamation of decline. Trade routes begin to bend toward more favorable harbors. Apprentices follow masters across borders. Capital looks for safer returns. The Dutch Republic's towns draw in merchants and skilled labor, not because of one miracle policy, but because the everyday arithmetic of doing business begins to favor them. When more of your cost base is non-tradable and tax-weighted, each year's budget feels heavier than the last. When more of your profit depends on navigating pledges, arrears, and permissions, the upside shrinks. People go where the upside grows. It's important to be precise here. Decline is a big word, and historians debate both the timing and the depth of Spain's economic fortunes across the 17th century. The point on this slide is narrower and firmer. Fiscal monetary choices, especially the resort to heavy indirect taxation tied to debt service, shift relative performance. Even if total output holds for a time, certain places, sectors, and skills become less competitive compared to rivals where institutions reduce frictions and align incentives with enterprise. Consider the export ledger. Urban manufacturers competing with northern cloth now carry the weight of higher local costs. A merchant abroad doesn't care that a town's bread tax rose to cover duros, he cares that the delivered price is less attractive and quality more variable. If the northern merchant can offer tighter delivery, steadier quality, and better credit terms, buyers drift his way. That drift shows up not just in prices, but in the stories merchants tell at fairs, where orders come from, which debts pay on time, which workshops keep their best hands. Confidence is a currency, and it tends to migrate with commerce. There is also a social undercurrent. When local budgets are pre-committed to service annuities, town councils have less room to invest in the very public goods that raise productivity, maintaining canals, repairing bridges, funding market enforcement, supporting poor relief in downturns so skilled hands don't scatter. Each neglected repair becomes a friction. Each delayed payment becomes a reason for a supplier to demand more upfront. The arithmetic of staying shrinks, the arithmetic of leaving grows. If you're listening for a moral in the mechanisms, here it is, quietly. A river of bullion and a web of debt can make a state look powerful while leaving city workshops brittle. Raising revenue through taxes that sit inside the cost structure of everyday life can turn a bustling town into a place where making things is just a little harder each quarter. And when there are alternatives, ports and provinces where rules better match enterprise, people vote with their feet, their tools, and their ledgers. So the ripple effects are not mystical. Indirect taxes raise non-tradable costs. Non-tradable costs squeeze urban producers. Squeezed producers lose ground to rivals whose institutional environment pays better for the same skill and risk. Trade and talent drift toward the Low Countries, where the payoff to enterprise is larger and more reliable. Whether or not you call Spain's story a decline, the relative performance gap widens, and you can hear it in the quieter streets of workshops that once hummed. When we say silver from Potosi, it can sound like a clean line on a ledger. In reality, it was flesh and breath and risk. Let's walk slowly through the human side of the production system and see how it was engineered, from labor drafts to mercury, to make rocks into revenue. Begin with labor. The scale of Cerro Rico was not sustained by volunteers alone. Indigenous communities across the Andean highlands were organized into rotational draft service that compelled thousands to spend stretches of their lives in and around the mines. Some families hired substitutes when they could, others sent young men because they had no choice. Imagine the journey, leaving a village field at high altitude, crossing cold passes to a city of ore dust, carts, and mints. The rhythm of the countryside, planting, tending, harvesting, was interrupted by the rhythm of the mine. Even when wages were technically paid, the coercive structure of the draft meant the baseline decision had already been taken out of households' hands. Inside the mining economy, not all work was the same. Some men blasted and hauled ore underground, in narrow galleries where rockfalls and hypoxia were part of the cost of doing business. Others fed the ore to crushing mills and grinding stones. And then, at the heart of the silver boom, there was the patio, the flat open yards where ground ore was mixed with salt, a copper-bearing reagent, and quicksilver, and then trampled for weeks by men and mules to coax silver into an amalgam. The genius of the patio process lay in its ability to recover metal from ore that earlier methods would have discarded. The cruelty lay in how that chemical trick multiplied exposure to mercury. Mercury is not a neutral co-worker. In Huancavelica, the quicksilver mine that fed Potosi, workers roasted cinnabar ore to release vapor that would condense into liquid mercury. The air itself became part of the risk. Prolonged exposure brought tremors, tooth loss, mood and memory changes, and a slow erosion of strength. In Potosi, during the final step of refining, amalgam was heated to drive off the mercury and leave silver behind. That meant vapor again, this time in the city that ate the product of the draft. Think about that loop: men compelled to leave their farms, handling mercury in production, and then breathing mercury when the silver was finished. A system designed for output also designed an atmosphere that worked against the bodies producing it. The supply of mercury was a choke point, and it reveals how upstream design shaped everything downstream. Huancavelica's quicksilver was treated as a royal monopoly. If shipments arrived on time and at set prices, Potosi's refineries could run at capacity. If a shaft collapsed, if a road was blocked by weather, if administrators changed the rules, the patios slowed. Silver output dipped. When output dipped, the reserves feeding treasuries and creditors tightened. If you trace that chain, you can see how a labor draft in a highland village and a price bulletin for mercury could ripple into the ledgers of a mint, and later into the war chest of a crown. The labor regime had its own market within a mandate. Men tried to manage risk any way they could. Some negotiated to work in less lethal niches around the mining city. Some hired replacements from poorer households. Some families took on debt against future draft wages and ended up bound to mine-related employers even after the rotation ended. Coca and alcohol softened fatigue and cold, but they also became part of the cash cycle that kept men tied to the workplace. The draft did not just move bodies, it reorganized time, diet, and habit. Consider the day in the life of a refiner on the patio. Before dawn, the air is thin and cold. The slurry in the yard is sticky and metallic. You test it by touch and rule of thumb, because formal assays are slow and expensive. Add another scoop of quicksilver. Work it longer. Cover it against frost. Weeks later, the mass is ready to be heated, the mercury driven off, the silver collected. If a shipment of mercury is late next month, the yard sits idle. If a batch of salt is impure, yields fall. Each hiccup in inputs is paid for by a longer day, a smaller wage, or another debt. The refinery's manager feels it has lost margin. The worker feels it has more hours on the yard and more time with a poison that does not announce itself loudly until it is too late. It is tempting to separate the moral story from the economic story, but here they are braided. The technical miracle of amalgamation turned low-grade ore into money. To do that at the scale demanded by empire, the system relied on compelled labor and a dangerous reagent controlled by the state. Those choices made silver flows more reliable, and they made sickness and loss more reliable too. The crown gained a steadier path from mine to mint to tax, and communities gained a steadier path from field to draft to funeral. It is harsh to say, but the pattern is plain: the more dependable the output for the treasury, the more predictable the strains on the people who produced it. Even if you look only through the lens of mechanism, the coupling is tight. Draft quotas move workers into mines. Mercury supply and pricing move yields up or down. Yields move mint output. Mint output sets the rhythm for payments, taxes, and credit back in the imperial core. None of this requires moral narration to be visible. The accounting entries themselves point back, with a straight line, to the patios and the shafts and the yards. When you follow that line, you are forced to admit that extraction was not a single stage. It was a design, with human bodies as components, calibrated to convert mountains into money on a schedule that served distant priorities. That is the human cost in the extraction engine. Not a footnote, but a structural part of how the system achieved its scale. Hold that in your mind as we continue, because once you appreciate how finely tuned these inputs were, the patterns we see in the wider monetary world begin to make a different kind of sense. Imagine the map zooming out. Our story doesn't stop at Seville, it widens into a planet-sized loop. Spain becomes the door through which silver enters Europe, but the metal does not simply pile up in Spanish coffers. It moves, fast, toward the places where it buys the most, settles the widest debts, and unlocks the rarest goods. Follow that current and you'll see why this is a global circuit, not a local windfall. Start with Europe's northern money hubs. After the fleets are tallied in Seville, large portions of bullion are committed, on paper and in practice, to settle balances through Antwerp and Amsterdam. Why there? Because those markets concentrate creditors, long-distance merchants, insurers, and shipowners who knit together the North Sea, the Baltic, and beyond. A bill due in Bruges gets cleared in a ledger in Amsterdam, a cargo risk taken in Hamburg gets insured through a syndicate with a correspondent on the Damrak. Silver helps net out these webs of claims. It's not romance, it's plumbing. The cleaner your settlement, the bigger the trade you can support next season. Now pivot the globe to the Pacific. Once a year, lumbering galleons push off from Acapulco, their hold stacked with silver coin, pieces of 8 stamped in the mints of New Spain and Peru. The destination is Manila. What waits there? A flotilla of junks and sampans loaded with Chinese silk, porcelain, fine tea, and lacquerware, along with spices from Southeast Asian ports. The exchange is simple in outline and astonishing in scale, New World silver for Asian goods. Silver is not merely accepted, it is sought. Why? Because in East Asian markets, especially in late Ming and early Qing China, silver holds a higher purchasing power relative to goods and even relative to gold than it does in Europe. Different money ratios, different tax regimes, different opportunities, that's the pull. Walk the docks in Manila on arrival day. Bales are opened, samples are examined, and the ritual of weighing coin begins. You might even see the future in someone's hand, a bright Spanish dollar already marked with tiny the stamps from Chinese merchants, each stamp a miniature testimony that this coin passed another trader's test. That same coin may cross to Fujian, then to a river town where a landlord settles rents in silver because a tax reform has commuted obligations into payments best made in that metal. One ocean away, a muleteer in New Spain remembers being paid with the same type of coin for moving ore to a mill. The two transactions are separate in culture and climate, but connected by the same monetary thread. Back in Europe, the drain eastward is not a mystery to merchants. They plan for it. A shipper in Amsterdam knows that some of the proceeds from Baltic timber or Dutch cloth will, after a series of exchanges, end up as silver shipped into Asian circuits. That is not a problem if goods flow back that Europeans value, pepper, textiles, porcelain, and if the round-trip ledger stays credible. But the direction of metal is clear. When silver buys more in Asia than it does at home, the metal moves. Arbitrage is not a theory to these people, it's their week-to-week logic. Notice the feedback. As silver pours into places where its power is strongest, it anchors contracts, wages, and taxes, which in turn deepen the habit of using silver. The more standardized the coin, those famous 8 reales, the more it becomes a portable unit of account across languages and laws. A merchant can land in a strange port, pull out a known coin, and start trading. That reduces frictions. Reduced frictions enlarge trade. Enlarged trade demands better settlement. And better settlement, once again, prefers dependable bullion. This is where the idea of Spain's silver becomes the world's silver. Spain is the initial funnel, yes. But the full system is a triangle: American mines and mints, European clearing markets, and Asian demand. Each corner shapes the other two. A storm that delays a fleet might tighten credit in Antwerp for a season. A policy shift in China that raises silver's role in taxes can pull more bullion across the Pacific. A new trading company in Northern Europe can alter the routes along which silver is mobilized and where the profits of carrying trade accumulate. None of these shifts requires a single mastermind, they are the emergent pattern of thousands of decisions made under different rules and incentives. Hold one last image. An Amsterdam factor closes his books at dusk, satisfied that today's balances are squared. A week later, the same silver that cleared his account will be lashed into a Manila galleon's hold. Months after that, it will jingle in a market town in China. The coin will not tell its story, but the prices it pays will. They will reveal, quietly and precisely, where the world values silver most, and how that valuation steers ships, contracts, and empires. That is the global silver circuit, a continuous loop from mountain to mint to market to sea, with Spain as conduit, the northern hubs as clearing houses, and Asian demand as a persistent pull. Once you see the loop, charts of prices and trade stop looking like separate stories. They are one current, running around the world. Shift your eyes from Seville to Amsterdam and you feel the ground rules change. Here, the big story is not a mountain of metal, it is a set of institutions that turn mixed, messy coin into clean settlement money and, by doing so, pull commerce into a tighter orbit. The Bank of Amsterdam opens in 1609 as something very practical, an exchange bank. Bring your clattering bag of coins, thick and thin, clipped and foreign, and the bank weighs and assays them in public view. In return, it credits you with bank money, a tidy balance on a ledger that you can transfer to someone else with a stroke. No haggling over the quality of each coin. No guessing whether that Spanish dollar has lost a sliver to the knife. Settlement becomes boring and reliable is a superpower in trade. Why does that matter? Because when people trust the unit in which they settle, they can argue about value, not about the scale. Bills of exchange payable in bank money become easier to price. Merchants who barely trust each other can still do business because they both trust the transfer at the end. The city reinforces this by requiring that larger payments be settled through the bank. That creates a critical mass. Once enough big deals flow through one clearinghouse, everyone near those deals wants an account. The agio, the premium on bank money over scruffy street coin, emerges as a barometer of confidence. Keep the bank's rules set tight, and the agio stays tame. Let the rules slip, and the premium flickers higher like a warning light on the dashboard. Notice what the bank is not, at least at the start. It is not a fountain of easy credit to favored insiders. It does not freely lend deposits into speculation. Its prestige rests on restraint, strict intake of coin by weight and fineness, careful record keeping, and transfers final when ink dries. That restraint sends a signal far beyond the counting room. If you are a shipper, you can settle a cargo without worrying that the medium itself will melt under you. If you are an insurer, you can price risk knowing the payment at the end will not add a surprise. If you are a provincial tax collector remitting funds to the center, you can move large sums without carting vulnerable coin over dangerous roads. But the bank is only one gear in a larger machine. The Dutch package includes city courts that enforce contracts quickly, notarial networks that standardize deals, and bankruptcy procedures that, while painful, are predictable enough to allow second chances. Partnerships are easy to form. Shares in chartered companies can be traded in a market where prices are posted, brokers are known, and settlements clear. Public finance is managed with an eye toward credibility, provinces raise revenue through broad-based excises and, crucially, maintain a reputation for paying interest on time. That reputation keeps rates low, which makes it cheaper to maintain fleets and dikes without crushing the private economy. Waterways and roads are not afterthoughts. Canals and harbors are maintained because they are arteries of the same system. Toll schedules are posted. Warehouses operate with transparent rules. The infrastructure is not grand for its own sake, it is precise for trade's sake. Even guilds that look restrictive from afar often function here as quality control networks that make promises believable across distance. If a bolt of cloth carries a known mark, a buyer in a foreign port can relax a notch, and a small notch multiplied by thousands of transactions becomes a big reduction in friction. Ask yourself a question that Dutch merchants answered in their bones. Where do I get the most return for one more unit of prudence? In Amsterdam, careful behavior compounds. Keep better books and you get bank transfers on time. Deliver on schedule and your bill discounts at a better rate. Insure your cargo with a reputable syndicate and you are welcomed at the next table. The rules align with the payoff to honesty and competence, and that alignment is not ideological, it is practical. It shows up in quieter court dockets, narrower bid-ask spreads, and the steady hum of ships that load, sail, unload, and pay. There is a moral texture here, too, without speeches. When a city builds institutions that make settlement solid and promises credible, it invites strangers to cooperate at scale. That cooperation pays for itself in thicker markets and steadier wages. It is not that risk disappears, storms still strike and prices still swing, but the shocks travel through springs instead of brittle rods. The system flexes and resets rather than shattering into disputes over the medium of payment. People can plan careers, not just voyages. So the counterpoint is sharp. In one setting, money enters through state channels that surge and stall. In the Dutch setting, a stable clearing mechanism and a web of predictable rules pull commerce into deeper water. No one had to declare a theory for this to work. They just had to build institutions that reward good behavior and keep the unit of account clean. Trade did the rest. Let's pull the threads together with the calm voice of data. Imagine 3 layers on the same timeline. First, a long price index for Spain built from staple goods. Second, a bar chart of bullion arrivals measured by decade. Third, shaded crisis bands marking the great payment suspensions. No rhetoric. Just lines, bars, and dates. Start with the price line. Through the 1500s it slopes upward, not in a neat diagonal, but in surges and breaths. The rise is unmistakable by mid-century, gathers momentum into the 1590s, and crests close to the turn of 1600. After that, the climb slows. By the middle of the 1600s, the line flattens and even softens in places. If you only had this one line, you would still suspect that something deep and sustained pressed prices up for a long time and then eased. Now glance at the bullion bars underneath. They swell after Potosí's discovery and the spread of mercury amalgamation, then remain high enough for long enough to matter. The bars do not match the price line month for month, of course they don't, but they give the whole century a different weight. A larger monetary base is not the only driver of higher prices, yet on the scale of decades, the association is hard to ignore. Where the bars are tallest, the price line tends to be steepest. Where the bars settle, the line moderates. It's not a drumbeat, it's a bass line you feel under every melody. Add the crisis bands. Mark the suspensions in the late 1550s, the late 1570s, the late 1590s, and the early 1600s. What do you notice? Price increases do not stop in those bands, but volatility becomes more visible in records of contracts, fares, and coin availability. A suspension is a plumbing event, payments halt, instruments are reworked, confidence takes a bruise. The price line may continue its longer trend, but the lived experience in those years is a tighter credit market and a choppier street. Now layer in the monetary composition without changing the axes. As the new century begins, small change copper issuance grows and the wedge between copper and silver pricing appears in the archives. In practice, that shows up as a faster climb in prices paid with copper for everyday items, while silver-denominated quotes move less or later. If you were to split the series into the mostly copper prices and mostly silver prices, the divergence would widen in the early 1600s. 2 price paths, same town. The average hides the fork. Step back and read the picture carefully. Prices rise broadly across the 1500s, bullion inflows are high, fiscal stress recurs, and, later, copper issuance adds a new layer of dispersion. Do we have to pick one cause? No. Population growth, shifts in trade, harvest failures, and war all leave fingerprints. But the overlays help you see mechanism rather than magic. First, a large, sustained inflow of monetary metal establishes the background pressure toward higher prices. Second, the fiscal system's strain shows up in episodic jolts that disturb credit and settlement. Third, the currency mix changes, and with it, the distribution of who feels inflation first. Consider what this means for interpretation. If you look only at a headline inflation rate, you might conclude the story was uniform. The overlays remind you it wasn't. When the price line moves, ask where the bullion came ashore. When the line wobbles in a crisis band, ask which payments were being renegotiated. When the line splits between copper-heavy and silver-heavy markets, ask who holds which coin and why. The series do not speak in slogans, but they do speak quietly, persistently, and with enough clarity to test narratives against dates. One more caution that helps, not hinders, understanding. Indices are built from baskets, and baskets reflect choices about goods, weights, and sources. That is not a flaw, it is a reminder to use the lines as guides, not gospels. The virtue of plotting prices, bullion, and crises together is precisely that each corrects the others. If a spike in the index coincides with a harvest failure but not with a bullion surge, you look to weather and supply. If prices keep rising through a suspension, you look at how merchants coped and where silver and copper actually circulated. The overlay is a map of questions as much as answers. So what do the series show? A century-scale rise that aligns with unprecedented silver inflows. Periodic fiscal strain that shakes confidence without reversing the tide. And a later, visible split in pricing paths when copper takes a larger role. In other words, the patterns you've heard in stories now stand still on the page, letting you trace cause and effect with a finger rather than a hunch. Let's end by asking the questions that the evidence itself keeps whispering. When money enters through narrow channels, who gains first, and who pays later? In our story, the first touch often belonged to miners, contractors, court suppliers, and crown paymasters. The later burden fell on towns that saw indirect taxes rise, on artisans squeezed by non-tradable costs, and on households whose small coins bought less each season. That sequence matters, because it turns a metal windfall into a map of winners and stragglers. What turns a treasure into a trap? Trace the chain slowly. A resource windfall arrives. Fiscal plumbing converts future taxes into today's spending. Payment suspensions bruise confidence. Then a turn to copper tries to stretch small change, and a wedge opens between prices in everyday markets and prices in silver. None of these steps is mysterious. Each one makes sense in the moment. Yet, taken together, they tilt an economy toward the activities closest to the inflow and away from the slow, compounding work of enterprise. That is how a century of rising prices can coexist with workshops that feel thinner every year. Not because people got lazier, but because the rules made certain choices pay less. Now place that beside a quieter counterexample. In the Dutch cities, a clean unit of settlement, credible courts, and predictable public finance did not conjure wealth out of thin air. They did something less flashy and more powerful. They reduced friction. They paid a steady premium for prudence and competence. Merchants and artisans responded because the path from effort to reward was less obstructed. Institutions did not replace talent, they amplified it. So the moral questions are not abstract. They are household questions. If new money must enter somewhere, can a society design channels that diffuse gains rather than concentrate them? If the state must borrow, can it do so without hardwiring tomorrow's revenue so tightly that town budgets suffocate? If small change is needed, can it be supplied without training everyone to keep two ledgers in their heads and hide the good coin? These are questions about incentives and credibility, not slogans. There is also a human register we cannot ignore. The silver that set prices drifting upward was mined by men whose time was drafted and whose lungs carried Mercury's mark. The reliability of output for the Treasury meant a reliability of strain for the people producing it. That link is not an indictment, it is a fact. And facts ask us to consider what kind of reliability we choose to build into our systems. Step back one last time. The lesson is not that central authority always fails or that markets always save. The lesson is gentler and, perhaps, harder. Systems that keep settlement credible, spread adjustment costs broadly and transparently, and reward voluntary cooperation tend to turn effort into progress more reliably over time. Systems that funnel money through narrow valves, pledge future income too tightly, or play frequent games with the unit of account tend to deliver surprises that compound in the wrong direction. You do not need to declare a doctrine to see it. The record shows it in prices, wages, migration, and the quiet decisions of families who moved their skills to where rules treated them better. So as you think about the Spanish price revolution, keep the moving parts in view. A mountain of silver, a web of debts, a turn toward copper, and a tale of two institutional worlds. The next time you hear a headline about money, inflation, or policy, ask three simple questions. Where does the new purchasing power enter? What rules shape its first uses? And how easily can ordinary people protect the value of their work? The answers will not only explain the past, they will help you read the present with clearer eyes. If you found this helpful and you want more thoughtful, entertaining history, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to go deeper, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase, in the description. There is plenty more on the channel if you enjoy ideas that respect your intelligence and your curiosity.